Many of today's biggest NHL stars are of Russian descent, but there was a time that none of them could have played in the National Hockey League. Hi, I'm Rebecca Brayton and welcome to WatchMojo.com. And today we'll be giving you our top 5 trivia facts about hockey in the Soviet Union and today's KHL.
Petrov is starting out. Petrov is coming down to the Canadiens line. He's in over the line. Kalamov going in, he scores!
It was a completely different world from what we see today in hockey. You see players, they come into the league, they eventually qualify for free agency, and they can pick and choose which team they want to play for based on any number of factors. And that was not the case then. You basically were owned in perpetuity in the Russian league. The best players were reserved for certain teams. One of the things that was kind of interesting about the Russian leagues during the Cold War is that there was this strong central government and the labor unions were very powerful, and all these teams were connected to a specific union or trade union. So Central Red Army, for example, which is the big red machine everyone knows about, that was the official hockey club of the Russian Army.
Ahead there's Shlukov. Shlukov over the line. There's the pass. Alexandria. He scores!
As far as we know with the Russian national team, I mean, this was a minimum 11-month-a-year job. There was no off-season. Usually their training would be held in these very isolated, out-of-the-way barrack-style grounds. They'd be separated from their family and their friends. From what I've seen, the number of hours that the average Russian player would dedicate to training and games would absolutely dwarf an average North American player, at least 5-6 times more hours per year than what the typical North American player would dedicate to training, practice, and games. And that's how important it was to the government, so that when they did go into these international tournaments, they could dominate. And they did. They were the best team in the world. As the Cold War sort of slowly started winding down, you could see the cracks starting to develop with these teams. There were stories about players escaping their training camps and trying to find a way to get back to their family, just to spend an extra moment with their family. They'd be tracking where you went, who you spoke to, how much money you spent, because if you suddenly had more money than you should be having on these trips, that would arouse suspicion. These players were a huge asset to their government, and they were not going to let them go.
Mikhailov takes his shot! He scores! Mikhailov fired it, Dryden got a piece of it, and it went in.
There were all these sort of folk tales, these mythological figures about athletes who had tried to defect and thought they were about to make it, and then all of a sudden the plans went awry, and next thing you know, they're back in Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain, and their lives have just completely been changed. The biggest name, and it's still the biggest name we talk about, and it's one of the better stories, so I like talking about it too, is the Stastny brothers. You have these 3 brothers from Slovakia. They're all incredibly talented. They have this synchronicity together on the ice that no one had ever seen, and just the way they came to North America, the way they were coveted by every team really in the National Hockey League. It eventually led to all kinds of very secretive, clandestine cloak and dagger meetings, trying to figure out a contract, trying to just find an opportunity to see when or if these players could have 5 minutes alone so they could try and bring them to North America. And when they finally did, one of the brothers was left behind. They knew his brothers had defected, so he was stripped of his livelihood, basically. He was kicked off the national team, kicked off his club team, and would rejoin his brothers a year later, but it was a very difficult year for him. And then as you go on down the line, you get into players, especially near the end of the Cold War, the players started getting very young, much younger than anyone had ever seen in terms of defectors. So you see guys like Sergei Fedorov, Alex McGillney, Peter Nedved, guys who became pretty productive players and big stars in the National Hockey League.
Here's Fedorov, puts on the brakes, snaps a shot, he scores! Sergei Fedorov!
The general consensus was that these players were star players, and they came to North America, and once they were in North America, they were made. It was done. They were stars. They were going to make money, and life was going to be so easy for them. For a lot of them, that's just where the struggle kind of started. The transition was so awesome for these players, especially the ones who were pretty young. They made the decision to be there. They were there voluntarily, but they were in a situation that I think a lot of them may not have been prepared for. Different country, different culture, different language, different everything. These were people who had never had a credit card, who'd never had a checking account, who, when they went to a grocery store, you had to snap up as much as you could because the supply was so short that it might not be there the next day. And then all of a sudden they're in the North America and they walk into a grocery store and they can't understand, they can't process how much supply there is. And that's something that NHL teams started to learn more and more about as they started bringing players over. They needed a bit more of a grooming. They needed someone who could sort of chaperone them through the process of learning the language, learning about the culture, and just getting themselves grounded in what was a completely different world for them.
16-летний возраст. Клочок шайбы делает отменную передачу.
I think there was sort of a debate at one point about whether players from Europe, and particularly Eastern Europe, had a preference in terms of the NHL or the KHL. And I think a few years later, we now know that the NHL is the standard and that's the league that the best players in the world want to play in. There is kind of a precedent here, obviously, and what we saw during the last work stoppage was that the top option for a number of players, especially the most talented ones, was to go to Russia and play there. It's probably the most competitive league after the National Hockey League, and the money obviously wasn't bad. You'd see players in Germany or Switzerland or Sweden, Finland, other leagues in other countries, but I think the understanding is that the KHL that's the next level after the National Hockey League.
Мазякин. Бросок.